Hey guys, welcome back. I've made a lot of videos recently about retirement, so obviously it's something I feel passionate about. But what I haven't talked about is my retirement journey, why I'm so obsessed with retirement, and where I've come from and where I'm going. So I thought I'd make a video about this so you can at least understand what I've done, what I'm planning on doing, and why. Let's start with why I want to retire. I don't just want to lay around on the couch and do nothing all day. I'm a hobbyist. I like to do lots of different things. YouTube videos is one of them. But I have a whole slew of other hobbies. I've talked about a few in other videos, like my chickens and bees and gardening and woodworking and other things like that. And in the future, maybe I'll make some videos on those. But there's always something that I want to do to either learn or keep my mind occupied. But of course, work kind of gets in the way of that because when you're working, you're not doing these other hobbies. But also, I like to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And when you have a job, you have a boss and you have others that you work with. And there's certain levels of expectation that they have. Of course, you're going to work. You have to be there at a certain time. You have to work so many hours. You have to produce. And in doing that, you end up making a paycheck, right? So these are things that happen in normal everyday life that everybody has to deal with, but when you're retired, you don't. Money is there. You've already saved for it. You don't have to work for it. You then can structure your day however you want to. You don't have to be at an office in a chair at any given time. So to me, retirement is just that. It's the freedom to do what I want to do when I want to do it, so that I can go and have fun with all of these hobbies without worrying about my obligations. Now, the way I got started in saving for retirement was the first real corporate job I ever had offered a 401k with a company match. And I looked at that and realized if I save money, the company's going to pay me more. So I was effectively getting a raise by saving more money. So I figured, well, why won't I do that? So what I did was saved the minimum that was required. I put away into my 401k the minimum that was required in order to receive the full company match. And it just made financial sense. If I wasn't doing it, I was just leaving money on the table. I was throwing it away. It was money that I could have had that I said, I don't need it. Well, why would I do that? So that's what got me started. But then I started thinking about it a little bit more and realized, hey, wait a minute, this is actually how I'm going to retire. My parents had jobs where they were getting some kind of a pension. Government jobs do this. Anything within a school system does this. Some of the older companies used to do this, but they've all moved away from that. A lot of them did so because they couldn't afford it anymore. They realized, oh, well, we overpromised. Now we have to pay so much money to all these retirees. So anyways, I realized I was going to have to fund my own retirement. There was no way that the government was going to do it for me, a pension was going to do it for me, anything like that. So I started thinking about this a little bit more, but it all started with that very first job that offered free money. Now, I will say that that job kind of flexed a little bit. I was going between contracting and working for the company, but in the end, when I was done and I moved on to my next job, I had $75,000 saved, which of course seemed like a lot of money, and I was really happy with that. But at the same time, I was looking at it thinking, this isn't enough money to retire on. This is going to take me forever to have a realistic amount. Well, compound interest comes into play. So of course, when I left that job, I hadn't seen it yet. But now here I am 15 years later, and I see that that money has grown 546%. So it is way more money at this point, and I've done nothing. I left it there in the funds that I wanted. I did move it over from the 401k into a rollover IRA so that it wasn't associated with the company anymore, but I still just put it into the fund choices I had, left it, and it's grown 546%. So that's pretty impressive, and that's great going forward because everything is going to do that. And of course, that money 15 years in the future is going to grow again. Maybe not that amount of money, but still, it's going to continue to grow. Now, in terms of what I invested in back then and what I invest in now, I read an article back in the early 2000s. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was someone saying that they didn't understand why anyone would ever invest in anything other than the S&P 500. They said all these funds are trying to beat that. That's what they measure themselves by. They say, how good did you do this year compared to the S&P 500? And some funds beat, some don't. Most that beat the S&P 500 index return for a year don't do that every single year. So they may beat some years and then they may fail and come in lower other years. So the article was basically saying, if I could give anybody today a suggestion on what they should do, it's just invest in the S&P 500 now and forevermore into the future. Now, we're talking 20 years ago that I read this article. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's good today and going forward. The stock market is kind of crazy right now. The S&P 500 is way up. And actually in the past few days here, it's been down. And depending upon when you watch this video, that may remain true for the days that you are in at that point in time. It's up and down every other day here. So over the last 20 years, I actually went back and figured out what the stock market did for that period of time. And let me look at my piece of paper here to tell you exactly what happened. So I expected, when I was planning out for retirement, I had come up with a little estimate of year over year. If I save this much, this is where I will end up. I use 7% as my estimate. So if I go back all the way to when I started in around 2000, I would have gotten an 8% return on the S&P 500. It beat my expectations. However, the first year I started, I had no money in there. I was just starting to contribute. And it just so happens that the first couple of years were bad years because that was 2000. That was the dot-com bust and then followed by 9/11. So there was a lot going on that was hurting the stock market back then. So if I only include from 2003 forwards, which is really when I was starting to get a reasonable amount of money, because at 6%, I was not contributing more than, I don't know, $1,000 or so a year, a couple thousand a year. After 2003, it averaged 10% from then until now. Now, I only did this up until 2020. I didn't do two right now. Right now, I'm at the end of 2021. So obviously, the stock market's gone nuts and has made a whole bunch more money over the past year. But excluding that, I made a 10% average. So I know you hear about all these averages where people say, oh, well, historically, the S&P 500 has done this, and they say back to the beginning of time, which is like in the 1920s. Well, that's not relevant. Today's market is so different than it was in the 1920s that I look at that and think, yeah, well, I'd rather use something more recent. And my lifetime is a pretty good example. Right? So I'm looking at 20 years of my personal investing in the S&P 500, and I've been able to make an average of 10%. So that's pretty great. I still suggest if you're looking at this going forward, use a more realistic number like 7% because it's always nice to be happily surprised by beating that number rather than be upset because you only got 5% and you're not anywhere near your retirement goals. What I ended up doing with that information of S&P 500 is great is I said, okay, well, I like the S&P 500, but there's several other things out there. There are other index funds that match other things. There are target retirement funds that say, okay, well, I plan on retiring around 2040 or something like that. So it will go ahead and change your allocations accordingly. So I ended up splitting my money between a few of those different things, but there were a few keys that I looked for. The S&P 500 funds always have really, really low fees, like 0.1%, something like that. And what that means is it takes 0.1% of your total portfolio and charges you that every year. Now, some back in the day, I don't know if they still exist today, but they could charge up to 2%. So if you had $1 million, they were actually charging you $20,000 a year just to have your money in that fund. So I looked for all funds that were very low cost, whether it be a target retirement fund or an S&P 500 index fund or other type of index fund. It was always low cost because I didn't want to give my money to other people. I wanted to save it for myself. Beyond that, I looked for some type of indexed fund. I really didn't want to be invested in one thing. You could say, oh, well, if you invested in Amazon, you'd have this much money. But would you have known back then? No. You could just as easily have invested in Blockbuster or Circuit City, something like that, that you thought, oh, this is going to be great, but they're gone now. So I liked funds that invested in a wide variety of things. And in doing that, it pretty much limited me to only a certain subset of funds, cheap and a wide variety. That's what I suggest for everyone. So I did that for so many years, and I kept contributing, kept saving. I started to see my portfolio value grow, and it was great. And then I wasn't maxing out my 401k, but I started thinking I could do that. I could keep increasing the amount that I'm putting in the 401k, but what if stocks don't do what I'm expecting long term? So when I was having these thoughts, it was like 4 or 5 years in from actually starting and having a reasonable amount of money in the stock market. I started to think, let's subsidize that with something else. Because that way I can know that if this thing fails, I have something else that maybe succeeds. So I was diversifying. Once again, beyond the separation of funds within an index, or separation of stocks within an index fund, I could do something separate. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come up with very many options. I basically came up with 2. Maybe 3 if you consider some kind of a banking like a CD, but that's not nearly enough return. So there were really only 2 high return options. One was start a business, and that usually takes away from your regular job. Like you might have to quit your regular job to do that, and you could fail. The other was investing in rental property. So I chose that option. Well, I started thinking about it, and I saved money. And then come 2008, the financial crisis hit. During that time, I really didn't feel it. I stayed employed, my wife stayed employed, everything seemed fine to us, but all of these houses on our block and all throughout the area we lived in started to go on the market. And as we started looking into those, we found out they were all foreclosures. There were tons and tons of foreclosures. So I ended up going and getting some books on rentals. I read 7 books on apartment rentals, single family rentals, duplexes, all kinds of things. And I decided what I really wanted to do was single family homes, because I thought I could get people in there that in theory made a reasonable amount of money, had good credit, needed something for their family, wasn't a high turnover rate, something like that. These were all the thoughts that were going through my head. So because the Great Recession was happening, there was the housing crisis and all these foreclosures, my wife and I went and bought one. And over the course of the next 10 years, we ended up buying 3. They were good investments, they worked out, but they eventually, as all landlords say, they got really annoying. And I'll make a whole other video on that for how that went, what that process was like. I'll call it Can You Get Rich with Rentals? So go check out that video if you're interested in what that process was like. But this was one of the legs to my retirement savings. And it did work. Despite all of the frustrations, we did make money on those 3 rentals. But since then, especially because of the pandemic and the market crisis that happened, the lockdowns, everything like that, we didn't want to have that risk. So during this time frame, we sold all of our rentals and we decided, okay, we're done with that, we're moving on. And it ended up working out because the stock market was down, we were able to sell the rentals, put the money into the stock market, and then the stock market has skyrocketed like what you've seen recently. So we kind of pivoted along the way, but looking for these things, trying to determine how can I best save? How can I leverage the money I have based upon what is going on at the time? The houses are down, buy houses. Rent them out for a while, houses are now really high. Sell houses, stock market's down, oh, I'll take that money, put it in the stock market. Stock market goes up, oh, well, maybe it's time to look for something else. That's kind of what my mindset has been over my career. Beyond saving into retirement accounts and the whole rental process that I just discussed, there were other things that I did over this same time frame, and those were creating a solid budget, making sure that I knew where my money was going, cutting out additional expenses that I didn't need. And that may be services I was paying for that I realized I hadn't used in the last 6 months. Maybe an example that most people use is having a gym membership that you haven't gone to in 2 years, but you're still paying for it. Well, I do all my working out at home, so I don't have to worry about paying for a gym membership. And that took some time too. I had to get a little bit of equipment, but still, I started focusing on all these areas that I might be wasting money on, and I tried to cut my bills down to the very bare minimum. Then I took the extra money I was saving and started to put that into retirement. So now me and my wife are both completely maxing our 401ks every single year in the intention of retiring early. Now, many of you are probably saying, oh, maxing it out every single year. Well, in 2022, the max is going to be $21,000. So we're going to have to put in $42,000 a year. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But we're doing it because we want to retire early. And if you're looking to do a FIRE retirement, this is what you have to do. You have to sock away tons and tons of money, a large portion of your income, and live on less. Because there was so much to this process of rentals and living within my means and coming up with a budget and trying to save more and more for retirement, I did end up writing a book. And I have another video on this out there that I made years and years ago, but here is my book, Mr. Rich versus the Joneses, Living Within Your Means. You can get it on Amazon in Kindle or paperback format. And in that book, I go over a lot of these items, what the experience was, how during the recession, the Joneses, which was effectively everybody that had houses around me that seemed to be having more stuff than me, I thought, oh, are they all rich? How is this happening? And the answer was no, they weren't trying to retire early. They were leveraging themselves as far as they could so that the minute they didn't have a paycheck, they had to go bankrupt or had to let their house go into foreclosure. And it worked out for me because I bought a rental. But still, that was one of the things that I ended up doing, was writing a book. One, because I had all of this experience that was complicated. Obviously, I've talked about a little bit of it here, but there was a lot more to it than that. A lot of research went into all these things that I did. Plus, as I was saying, I was looking at different legs of how I can save and make money, and writing a book and possibly selling a book could do that. Now, as of today, this book has still made me almost no money. I think I have maybe offset what it cost me to get the design for the front and publish it. So it didn't end up working out, but you have to try. Not everything will work out. You never know. But you have to try a wide variety of things if your intention is to retire early. So that brings me to today. What's next from here? Well, I'm planning on continuing to max out our 401ks until that amount of money becomes enough that we can use it to retire. And it's not just the 401k money, we also have the money from the rentals that are now in stocks. So all of that together, when it becomes enough for me to retire, then I can. We'll continue doing that. But when that is enough is a big question. So now I have to determine what is my F.I.R.E number. As I've said in many other videos, I plan on doing F.I.R.E. I want to really enjoy retirement. So I have to figure out exactly what that number is. Is it $2.5 million, which is $100,000 a year, which is what a lot of F.I.R.E people say? Or is it more than that? Or can I suffice on less than that? I'm thinking right now it's probably going to be more, but that's one of the next steps. I also need to figure out the whole ACA Obamacare thing. I've made a video on that. I know what's offered today, but that's not what's going to be offered 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I have to keep an eye on that. Taxes are another big item. I've got to figure out how am I going to leverage my accounts to get the most tax advantaged income. And I've got that in another video. I'll actually have another video in the future about tax retirement hacks and what you can do for that. But while the ideas are great, they depend upon the amount of money. So for example, if you had all of your money in something that was a capital gains tax, let's say you had it in the regular stock market and you could pay long-term capital gains. Well, if you fall within an $80,000 bracket for capital gains, it's tax-free. So if your money is 50% taxable and 50% principal, so your gains and your original, and you pull out $160,000, 80 of it would be taxable, 80 of it would be tax-free. Your capital gain would be $80,000, which would all be tax-free. So I've got to figure out how that works so that I can fund my retirement within the tax rules. Now, I know I was saying $120,000, $100,000, those are the F.I.R.E numbers, and I would fall well within. However, all of my income is not going to be from stock sales. there's going to be dividends and interest. And at some point I'm going to be taking from my 401ks, and inflation happens and therefore you have to take more money. So there's a lot of changes that happen. So that's one of the things I'm going to be focused on over the next few years. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video that I had anticipated 7% way back when I started and when I started tracking this stuff, and the stock market has done 10%. So I am well ahead right now of where I originally planned to be, which sounds great. Unfortunately, that also coincides with now I want more money in retirement. So way back when I started, my expectations were much, much smaller. Like, hey, if I can get to $1 million, I'm great. Well, that's not gonna fit what I want to do anymore. So now I have to deal with a much larger number. So instead of 1 million, we might be looking at 2 or 3 or 4 million or something like that. And the older I get and the more my lifestyle increases and the more inflation increases, the higher that money goes, the higher the amount that I feel like I'm gonna need goes. So now, even though stocks have outperformed what I expected, my expectations have increased, so now I want even more. And I think everybody does that to some extent. Not a bad thing, but it's great that I am already beyond, far beyond, where I had originally expected to be. That coincides well with my increased expectations now. So I'm going to continue to do that, and I have redone my spreadsheet that I had in order to determine, okay, where am I, where do I want to be, and what do I expect it to be going forward. And in redoing that spreadsheet, I went ahead and used that same 7% return expectation, because I thought that worked well for me over the past 20 years, and I beat it. But there's no guarantee that I'm going to beat that in the next 10 years or so. So it's better to be safe than sorry. I would rather know that I have what I think is a realistic expectation and then be pleasantly surprised at the end, rather than have the other way around where I was expecting a 10% return and it didn't happen. And I think that's especially true right now. We got something like a 30% return in the last year. That is not sustainable, and there will probably be a pullback before it continues to go up. So I cannot expect a 10% return over the next 10 years. There's just no way. So by having a realistic goal moving forward, I can have a realistic expectation of what that actual retirement date's going to be. One last thing I'll add that has changed my expectation for retirement money, beyond just wanting to have more money to do things, is the cost of healthcare and the cost of certain things have far surpassed inflation. So I'm now wanting more and more of a buffer to accommodate these things in the future. If healthcare continues to go up and I have to pay something like $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month for healthcare in the future, that's more money than you can easily take out of a lean F.I.R.E budget. So you really have to get a buffer for a lot of these things. Obamacare's helping with that. That's great. Will that be here in 10 years? I don't know. Will it be something else? I don't know. So I need to make sure I have enough money for it. I hope this was helpful. I wanted to give an idea of where I've come from, what changed in my mind along the way, what changed within the economy along the way, what my investments have actually done for me looking back over my career, and give you an idea of where I'm coming from, why I make these videos, what kind of experience I have had, and how I've pulled from that experience in order to build up retirement savings and a plan for the future. If you like this video, please subscribe below or add a comment if you'd like to discuss what I've talked about today. Also, click the bell icon if you'd like to get notified when I post more videos. That's all I have for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.